Welcome to Wednesday's edition of COVID-19, a roller coaster ride where daily infection numbers are concerned here in Korea as we move between double and triple digits. Meanwhile, the US has surpassed the 9 million mark as the country prepares to select a new leadership in a week from now. We have more on that later on in the program. Here first is our Kwon So-ah with the latest on the pandemic. Right, so yesterday we spoke about a decline. Today we're speaking about a rise in cases here in Korea.
Yes, Sunny, and as you just mentioned, it really feels like a roller coaster when it comes to the daily caseloads here in Korea these days. The numbers have been quite unpredictable, going back and forth between the double digits and the 100s. We had a rise here on Monday, a decline on Tuesday, and now again an increase this Wednesday. So that brings the total number of infections here in the country now to 26,146 with 103 additional cases here. The death toll at 461 and a little over 1,600 people in quarantine, and people who made a full recovery has surpassed 24,000. Meanwhile, out of the 103 cases here, we have 96 domestic infections, which means actually a decline in imported cases, which stood at 7 cases. And now let's take a look at where the new infections were detected this Wednesday. We have 31 in Gyeonggi-do Province, 25 in the capital Seoul, 10 in Int'L. Many of these are linked to cluster infections at medical facilities, as well as a golf meeting, which actually happened in Gyeonggi-do Province. But there are chain transmissions that have led to cases in the capital Seoul as well. And here, quite a number of new cases in Gangwon-do Province, some of those linked to a restaurant, and that also infected some kids. And that again led to hundreds of children and teachers who had to leave their schools, and now massive contact tracing is happening again there. So that really shows us how just single-digit figures and just one location can lead to those secondary and tertiary transmissions as well.
Right. So was it yesterday when we were talking about concerns of the upcoming Halloween celebrations for this weekend?
Yes, yesterday, the day before, authorities have been mentioning how important it is to be careful on Halloween.
Right, and I understand that clubs have now taken these concerns into account.
Right, Sunny. Popular large-sized nightclubs in the capital, Seoul, have decided to help government's containment efforts by closing on Halloween, which falls on Saturday this year. And they are going to close until next Tuesday. And that includes nightclubs in Itaewon, Gangnam, and Hongdae, including one that was part of a large cluster linked to Itaewon back in May. So some relief for health authorities, but smaller nightlife facilities, pubs, restaurants, hotels, and even the streets won't be free from risks, which calls for extra vigilance. Now, government inspections will also be conducted on entertainment facilities, such as proper keeping of entry locks and maintaining distance among visitors. And Halloween is, of course, also expected to be an issue in many other parts of the world, which actually celebrate Halloween even more widely than here in Korea. One of those countries would be the US, which just surpassed 9 million total cases with 75,000 new infections. In just a matter of hours, India is expected to surpass 8 million cases. And here, France also seeing resurgences with over 30,000 of new infections as of 12 p.m. here Korea time, and we also see that the UK has now become the country with the 9th highest infections around the world. And also Germany over here is seeing resurgences, which has just surpassed the total infections in Iraq with over 13,000 new infections. And now let's take a look at the global figure. 460,000 new infections in just 24 hours, and also over 6,700, almost 6,800 new fatalities, which raises the death toll to over 1.17 million. And those are the updates I have for now. No government briefing on Wednesday afternoons, so I'll be back with more tomorrow. Back to you, Sunny.
Right, so thank you for that. I will see you back here tomorrow then. Right, back on the local front, President Moon Jae-in delivered his annual budget speech today, during which he vowed to use next year's budget to fight the pandemic and revive the economy. For more, I have our Kim Han-il joining me here in the studio. Welcome, Han-il.
Good afternoon.
So what were the key highlights from the president's speech earlier this morning?
Well, improving Korea's economic fortunes was the main highlight of President Moon's speech earlier this morning. And he mentioned the word economy a total of 48 times in his speech. So the president said he will spend in the next year's budget to fight the pandemic and help the economy recover at the same time. The government proposed a record of 556 trillion won, or roughly 470 billion US dollars for the national budget next year, which is 8.5% higher than this year's budget. The president said Korea's economy has rebounded in the third quarter, citing the Bank of Korea's latest growth figures.
Right, and speaking about the Bank of Korea's latest growth figures, could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So Bank of Korea announced yesterday that the local economy shows some modest growth in the third quarter, which is thanks to the rebound in exports. In the July-September period, the nation's GDP rose 1.9% from the previous quarter. This is largely due to the 15.6% on-quarter growth in exports, as outbound automobile and semiconductor shipments increased with the easing of restrictions in Korea's major trading partners. However, consumer spending remains fragile due to worries over the spike in local cases that were witnessed here in Korea back in mid-August. So Finance Minister Hong Nam-ki said the government will take further measures to stimulate consumptions in the fourth quarter.
Well, that is good to know. Hanal, I understand that despite the signs of improvement on the economic front, Korea's job market is not faring as well.
That's right. So the latest figures released by Statistics Korea yesterday says the number of total people with jobs in Korea actually fell for the first time in 2003, and temporary workers were among those who were hardest hit by job cuts. Let's take a look at the graph here. Korea's total employment stood at 20.4 million in August, which is down by 1.9% on year. If we break the numbers down by employment category, the number of regular workers, which comprise roughly 63% of the workforce, fell by 58,000. But what's more concerning here is the number of temporary workers, which decreased by 55,000. And you may think the difference between 58 and 55,000 may not appear big in absolute terms, but what's more worrisome is the gap when considering the fact that the number of temporary workers is only around half of that of regular workers. Let's zoom in a little bit further. The number of contract workers fell by 177,000, and this group includes those who are on fixed short-term contracts and renewed contracts. It's rare to witness such a decline in total employment, which is usually on a steady upward trend considering the population growth. So in addition to the fewer jobs, the wage gap between regular and non-regular workers is also widening, adding to the woes being reported in the job market.
I see. Meanwhile, I hear that loan restrictions have been eased by the government as well.
Yeah, so if you are financially suffering from the pandemic, you can now be eligible to apply for loans using the money you've put into the government pension program. So under the current system, you can apply for collateral loans or ask for an early settlement on your pension only if you are looking to buy your first home, if one of your family members receive medical treatment lasting 6 months or more, or if you file for bankruptcy. But the Labor Ministry announced the revised rules yesterday, adding that COVID-19 should be recognized as an individual crisis of its own. So the government now hopes to ease the financial burden of people who have either lost their jobs or saw income losses amid the pandemic, allowing them to tap into their pensions.
Right, and finally, I hear the government is going to be investing heavily in the service sector to create jobs over the next 5 years, is it? Tell us more.
Sure. So the government announced that it'll invest 7 trillion won, or around 6.2 billion US dollars in R&D ventures for the service sector over the next 5 years. Finance Minister Hong Nam-ki said Tuesday that these funds are partially aimed at promoting contact-free services in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. His remarks came during a meeting of economy-related ministers that also discussed innovative growth strategies. The strategies include beefing up R&D spending in 4 service sectors: tourism, public health, content creation, and logistics. In addition to these sectors, the government will also fund sectors like contact-free education services, e-commerce platforms for small business owners, and other services that are growing in demand amid COVID-19.
All right, Hannah, thank you for that coverage. I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Right, on the international front, amid the health crisis, more than 65 million votes have already been cast around the US, which is reportedly a record-breaking pace that could lead to the highest voter turnout in more than a century. Now, for more on the presidential race, there I have Chang Sung-Kwan from the Korean American Grassroots Conference live on the line. Hello, Sung-Kwan.
Hi, good afternoon, Sunny.
Right, now I believe there is about a week left to the US election day. What is the atmosphere there like? And, what is the atmosphere there like as the presidential candidates, that is, take on their final rallies, Song-Kwan?
Well, like you just mentioned, Sunny, there's a high level of enthusiasm in the United States. By this morning, more than 66 million ballots have already been cast, both in person and by mail, which amounts to nearly half of total votes counted in the 2016 election. And many estimate that the voter turnout this year will reach historic levels. But with such a volume and high level of participation come a few obstacles. For example, in states like Georgia, Texas, and New York, where early voting started just last week, voters had to wait for hours just to enter the polling place. There have also been reports of intimidations at polling places, especially in states with open carry laws like Florida and Michigan, where some people have showed up heavily armed and donned with campaign apparel of the candidates they support. And of course, the concerns for safety in this pandemic run very, very high, which led to many states expanding access to mail-in ballots this year. But that led to a lot of confusion among the voters and a high level of suspicion and mistrust in the U.S. postal system, with several allegations of mail-in ballots being processed late and even left out at delivery. Drop-off boxes have also been installed in more than a dozen states as well, but the attempts to tamper these measures have been reported in states like California and Massachusetts, where at least one ballot drop box was reported to have been burned. There are only 6 days left to the election now, and it's not certain how many people will actually vote in person next Tuesday and how long it will take for all ballots to be properly counted across the United States.
I see. Song-Kwan, who appears to be leading the national presidential polls right now?
Well, according to the national average over the past 2 weeks, it's Vice President Biden leading President Trump by at least 7.1 percentage points. And that's every single major poll showing Biden ahead of Trump. But of course, in the battleground states, poll numbers point every which way. It is interesting that in traditionally Republican strongholds like Texas and Georgia, Biden has gained significantly over the past week. And in these two states, just 2 years ago, statewide elections like the governor and Senate races resulted in a very, very narrow margin between the Republican and Democrat candidates. So that means this year there are even fewer bellwether states, which come down to North Carolina, Ohio, Michigan, and Arizona.
Song-Kwan, could you perhaps touch upon the reasons for support behind each candidate within the Korean American community?
Well, so among the Korean American registered voters, we at KAGC estimate that about a third of Korean Americans lean Democrat and a quarter Republican. In other words, most of Korean American voters are not affiliated with any political party and are completely independent. And especially when it comes to this year's election, partisan affiliation means even less for our community. And I would say right now it's virtually half and half, because those who support Vice President Biden tend to be aligned with the Democratic Party's social values like diversity and inclusion. And many also cite that they trust Biden's long history of public service and his years-long leadership on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which ironically is often exactly the point of criticism coming from the Trump support base. And for those Korean Americans who support President Trump, the primary reason seems to be their optimism for engaging North Korea and an eventual reunification of the Korean Peninsula. Other than that, there's a variety of reasons like personalities of the candidates, concerns for tax rates and economy recovery. But since most Korean Americans tend to be centrist in terms of political ideology, the candidates' stances on one or two major issues can swing our community, whose votes have been getting more and more chased after and courted over the years.
How many Korean Americans are eligible to vote, and what are your prospects of the voter turnout among them?
So there are about 2 million Korean Americans, and maybe about 1 million are voting eligible population. That means 18 years of age or older and U.S. citizens. But the actual number of registered Korean American voters is far below that, at about 300,000 across the country. And the registration rate and turnout rate vary greatly by state, but we estimate that at least 70% of registered Korean Americans would participate in this year's election, in line with the trend of an extraordinary turnout rate in general this year.
Sangwon, before you go, do tell us a bit about the Korean American Grassroots Conference.
So KAGC was established in 1996, first in New York City under the name Korean American Voters Council. The idea came of long and difficult introspection among Korean Americans following the infamous 1992 LA riots, which led to a countrywide awakening that we are not visitors, that we're not foreigners, and that we need to start getting involved beyond just the Korean speakers and claim ownership over ourselves and over our community. So in order to equip and empower Korean Americans, regardless of English proficiency or immigration status, our organization was established to help them register to vote, access information necessary to be part of the policymaking process, and eventually to advocate for our community and for ourselves. Over the past 25 years, we've had several changes within our organization, but since 2014, we've been hosting the largest annual gathering of Korean American voters here in Washington, D.C. every summer, where hundreds of community members fly in from all over the country to organize a blitz of in-person meetings with members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, on issues priorities of our community. Under the name Korean American Grassroots Conference, we work with 30 local community partner organizations across the United States.
One final very brief question, Sangwon. How would you explain the greater interest among U.S. voters in the presidential race this time around?
Well, I'll try my best to keep it short, but as you know, Korean Americans are double, triple minorities in the American society because we are not only people of color, but most of us are immigrants, and especially in the sphere of politics and public affairs, we lack visibility pretty much. So any election, especially a major election like the presidential election, let alone one that has outsized attention like this one this year, is a great opportunity for social minorities like ourselves, especially those facing perpetual foreigner syndrome, to show to the rest of the society that we are here to stay, that we are very much Americans ourselves too, and that we are major stakeholders in our country, in this society.
I see. All right, Sangwon, thank you very much for making the time to join us at this very late hour with your thoughts.
Thanks for having me.
Right. Autumn outings have been a popular leisure activity here in Korea, and with social distancing at level 1, quite a number of people are seen to venture outdoors accordingly. In this next report, we share with you some of these safety measures to keep in mind while indulging in the sights and sounds of the season.
I am at Bukhansan Mountain, one of the most popular fall foliage destinations in South Korea. And as you can see, the mountain is filled with various colors, and it is speaking to the brightest scenes. It is stunning, it is breathtaking. However, at the same time, this is concerning because more people at the mountain means you are at a higher risk for COVID-19 infection. So today, we are going to learn more about COVID-19 prevention guidelines for hiking to ensure your safety.
올라오는 길에 조금 숨이 차니까 마스크를 살짝 벗기도 하는데 그런 거는 이제 더욱더 우리가 조심을 해야 되겠죠? 코로나로 인해서.
가능하면 좀 더 안전하게 산행을 할 수 있도록 노력하고 있습니다.
The Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters has designated this year's autumn-foliage season between October 17th and November 15th as a special antivirus period to prevent a major resurgence of COVID-19 across the country.
정부 시책에 맞춰서 등산로 입구에 탐방 지원 사태에서 그 발열 체크, 이제 원하시는 분들은 발열 체크를 하시고 이제 산행을 자제시킵니다. 그리고 이제 마스크를 구두기 안 가져오신 분들한테는 저희가 이제 확인해가지고 마스크 지급도 이제 하고 있습니다. 그리고 시간별로 항상 방역을 합니다. 이제 공동 화장실이라든가 여러 탐방객들 오는 그런 데 같은 데는요.
So these empty parking lots are originally for large buses. However, due to concerns over COVID-19, some major hiking spots across the country decided to ban the entry of large buses. And now the government recommended the public to rather use their own vehicles and public transportation.
The Korean National Park Service has completely banned entry of the 58 most crowded zones in 21 national parks. Those are outdoor spaces. Then why should we avoid visiting those spots?
전파의 위험이 실내가 실외에 비해서 높은 것은 맞지만 실외라고 하더라도 사람들 사이의 간격이 좁고 또 감염되어 있는 사람의 바이러스가 많이 배출되고 있는 상황이라면 전염이 될 수 있습니다. 그러니까 실외라고 하더라도 또 뭐 바람이 많이 부는 곳이라고 하더라도 여러 사람이 밀집해서 모여 있는 곳은 좀 피하는 것이 바람직합니다.
Other than masks and physical distancing, what are some other rules that people need to follow while hiking?
뭐 스카프나 아니면 뭐 이렇게 망사 같은 걸로 되어 있는 것으로 착용하시는 분들도 있더라고요. 그런데 사실은 그렇게 효과적이지는 않습니다. 그리고 호흡기 질환이 있으신 분이라면 마스크 착용이 이제 뭐 호흡에 좀 많이 영향을 주어서 뭐 만성 폐쇄성 폐질환이 있다거나 이런 분들은 굉장히 힘드실 가능성이 있거든요. 그런 분들은 마스크를 착용하고 거친 운동, 등산 이런 것은 오히려 하지 않는 것이 바람직합니다.
When you're hiking, you need to keep a 2-meter distance from others, and face masks need to be on properly all the time. Have a hand sanitizer handy at all times and sanitize your hands as much as possible. It is okay to take off your mask when eating, but except for that, it needs to be on at all times.
We're well into the heart of autumn season. However, hiking without proper prevention guidelines can lead to another major COVID-19 resurgence. So remember, following prevention guidelines at all times is more important than ever. Hope you guys enjoy Colors of Autumn safely. This has been 신세벽.
유럽을 비롯한 세계 곳곳에서 재봉쇄 등의 비상조치를 강화하고 있습니다. 이에 반해 우리는 방역조치를 완화한 특별하고 예외적인 나라가 되었습니다.
Restrictions are back in place in Europe as authorities there tackle a resurgence that is raising infection numbers at an alarming rate. Now, in today's studio session, we discuss this reality as well as that here in Korea, where restrictions have been slightly eased. Now, for more on this, I have Dr. David Kwak from Suncheon University Hospital. Welcome back, Dr. Kwak.
Thank you for having me.
And in the spirit of social distancing, I have Professor Lee Han-sung from Yonsei University joining our talk virtually. Welcome back, Professor Lee.
Thank you for the invitation.
Dr. Kwak, let's begin with your thoughts on Korea's handling of the pandemic as revealed by the country's statistics on COVID-19.
Right. So we're doing quite well in regards to balancing the economy and also mitigating the virus. We have seen the number of unrooted cases go down from 20-something% to now 11%. That is actually a very good news because it means that we have less of a chance now for random pop-ups here and there to cause actually bigger sized cluster infections. But also, we're seeing a prospect in an economy that is relatively better than the other countries. I believe OECD, among the OECD countries, we were ranked quite high in the prospect that we were only prospected of -1% in the GDP growth next year, compared to other countries being prospected of 30-something percentage. So I think those are a good accomplishment by the government. I want to applaud them for doing such a good job. But on the other hand, at this moment, we have seen an increase in the number back up to 110 and almost 96 of the domestic cases. So we're not at completely a situation where we could just relax and be lenient on the regulations all over again. What's worrying me a little bit more personally, though, is that among the domestic cases, we've started to see numbers not grow in, let's say, originally expected places, such as in nursing homes. We are still continuing to see those numbers, but we are also starting to see numbers growing in, let's say, golfing gatherings and also family gatherings. These are smaller clusters than compared to the ones we've seen before. If we start, and it also means that people are definitely getting lenient in keeping the social distances. So I would urge everyone to still be reminded that we're still going through a very hardship of the pandemic, and it is not over yet. And what's more worrisome is that we might even see a rise in the number back up again if we become too lenient in keeping the regulations. So once again, I want to take this moment to emphasize and urge our citizens to abide by the rules, keep the 3 W's, and still be reminded that we still need to be very careful.
Right. Authorities have touched upon the danger of complacency, as you mentioned. Meanwhile, Professor Lee, how would you explain the current resurgence over in Europe?
I think that is partly a reflection of a far more expanded testing regime in place compared to the early spring when we saw a surge in Europe. But the surge mainly is the result of reopening the economy and revived travel and tourism in summer, and the current colder weather, which is pushing people indoors and therefore facilitating the transmission. The mask wearing regulations don't seem to be effective enough because the interventions may have become in a late stage.
I see. Now, for more on the situation in Europe, I have the Danish ambassador to Korea, Einar Jensen, live on the line. Thank you for being with us, Ambassador Jensen.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Ambassador Jensen, please do start by telling us a bit about the COVID-19 situation in Denmark. I understand earlier this past Monday, authorities there noted a record of more than 1,000 cases.
Yes, we have seen Denmark was hit by COVID-19 in March, and then we had a relatively good summer. So the second wave has now set in Europe, and just like the rest of Europe, we are experiencing quite a rise. Yesterday, the numbers were 745 new cases, and this might sound very high for Koreans, but in the European context, it's actually lower than the average new cases per day. Also important to consider is that we are testing more than ever before. We are testing more than all European countries, with the exception of Luxembourg. And in fact, about half of our population has now been tested, and many of them have been tested several times. The Danish government is working hard to contain the spread of COVID-19, and we have enlarged the testing capacity. I think yesterday they tested 45,000 or something. It's now also mandatory to wear masks in public spaces, and that's something the Danes were not used to. Most of the Europeans were not used to, like you are here in Asia. We have lowered the number of people who can gather in open space to 10 now, and in general, they're also advised to not be in contact with more than 10 people in your spare time or free time. On the positive side, I would mention, though, that Denmark has a relatively low case fatality rate of 1.7, which is comparable to Korea's case fatality rate of 1.8. So maybe not as bad as we expected, but of course we need to keep the numbers down.
Right. Dr. Kwak, I believe you have a question for the ambassador.
Ambassador Jensen, I appreciate your sharing your valuable time with us today. I would like to ask a personal question. So I was looking at a poll done among the Danish people back in August, and I noticed, I couldn't help but notice that the citizens were very happy with the measures that government has taken in the first wave. So I would like to ask you, what were some of the measures that the government has taken that made people so happy? And also, I would like to ask, were there any changes made in regards to the measurements that were done by the government in relation to the second wave of the resurgence?
Thank you for this question. I think many people felt that the restrictions imposed by the government overall have been appropriate and proportional to the threats that the COVID-19 virus poses. And it was done very swiftly by our Prime Minister back then and a team around her. So it has been appreciated in general. During the first wave back in March, Denmark went into a lockdown. We closed down all public institutions, schools, most offices, as well as restaurants and cafes and so on. And now during the second wave, the government has took a different approach, one that is more similar to the Korean approach. You could say masks are mandatory in public spaces. Also, there are restrictions on opening times for bars and cafes, but not totally closed as we saw in springtime. And I think it was a strong stand by our Prime Minister that has been appreciated by the public as such.
Right. Ambassador Jensen, speaking within your capacity as a diplomat stationed here in Korea, what are your thoughts on Korea's containment efforts?
Oh, I think Korea has done great. It's your efforts here about testing, tracking, and follow up. That's an example that is of great inspiration to many countries, and including Denmark.
Ambassador Jensen, are there any bilateral plans in the works between Korea and Denmark then with regard to the pandemic?
Yeah, Denmark and Korea has been actively cooperating in the health sector for quite some time, and COVID-19 has risen as one of the key areas with the worldwide pandemic. To give a couple of examples, I just would like to mention on the bilateral level, the embassy recently hosted a seminar together with Korean Ministry of Health and Welfare and the National Health Insurance Service and their Danish counterparts. The topic of the seminar was aging in the times of COVID-19, as it is important to acknowledge the side effects of the preventive measures against COVID, including the effect on the mental health of especially senior citizens. I mean, the senior citizens are the ones most at risk, so we need to take them into account as well. To mention another example on the multilateral level, Denmark is co-chairing the group of Friends of Solidarity for Global Health Security, together with Korea and a few other countries. This is an initiative from the Korean government, and the purpose is to address the impact of global health security challenges, including COVID-19. We recently had a side event during the 75th session of United Nations General Assembly, where the impact of COVID-19 was discussed, especially on the youth. These are only a few examples. Our two countries are actively cooperating and engaging with the authorities, key stakeholders, and experts in the matter, including, of course, also the private sector.
Right. All right, Ambassador Einar Jensen, thank you very much for making the time to join us live today.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Right. Dr. Kwak, a number of countries showed interest in Korea's strategy, which Ambassador Jensen has spoken so kindly about earlier on in the pandemic. Would you happen to know of any country that sought to implement perhaps a similar strategy and saw a little bit of success?
Well, I can pinpoint to Italy's case. I know for a fact that they're having also a resurgence again, so their numbers are still rising. But in a few months back, they implemented a vigorous tracing of the cases in cluster infections. They also implemented, as Ambassador Jensen also mentioned, Italy also implemented limiting hours for restaurants and public spaces to limit the numbers of going in mass gatherings. They've also implemented 14-day quarantine, which we did exactly the same amount for people who are coming in from overseas. And they also implemented distancing of at least 1 meter in between everyone who's outside. So it's not just Italy, though. It's many other countries that are implementing a very similar measure that we have taken starting quite a while ago. We already know that massive tracings, it began here. We already know that testing as many people as possible were also began in Korea. So I am proud to say that K-quarantine is giving a very exemplary model for many other countries in not only the western side of the globe, but also in many other countries as well. So I would like to I would like to mention that I'm very proud of the fact that we did so.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Yi, in contrast, there are other countries that sought to put into practice Korea's containment framework, but did not see as much success, right?
Yeah, I think the marked difference is the capacity in performing those tests and tracing the context. And a couple of reasons account for this contrast, I think. First, Korea was more prepared for large-scale testing, including the testing of asymptomatic individuals, because they experienced firsthand the impact of the flawed response of the MERS outbreak in 2016. A series of reforms were made to boost preparedness, which include the training of personnel, which area I think the UK and many other European countries are struggling. I think European people value individualism and protection of privacy more compared to the Koreans, who seem to go out of their way to promote collective interest. I'm not saying which is better, but when dealing with a public health crisis, the latter seems to work well.
I see. Dr. Kwak, which is why quite a bit of praise has been extended to members of the public here for abiding by safety precautions. And of course, we even have bars, as our consul mentioned earlier, who are planning to close their doors to seek to deal with possible infections during the Halloween celebrations this coming weekend. As a doctor yourself, how would you assess public participation in the fight against the pandemic here in Korea?
Well, public participation is absolutely important. Well, it's probably the most of in regards to the proportion in effect to mitigating the virus. Public participation is obviously the one most important part of it. As you can see, if we in other countries, even though a government could implement certain regulations and measurements, if people don't follow it, it's going to be of no use. And we have clearly seen that when people were aware of the government's intentions behind putting such measurements in, they followed it very well, and we were able to mitigate it to virus becoming very low in the numbers. So once again, I'm very proud that our citizens did that. Another fact that what business could possibly close their own doors to fight against the virus as a whole nation? I believe because we are Koreans, we are able to do that, and I hope that we could also set another example to other countries that we as citizens could fight this pandemic as a whole nation.
Right, and keeping that in mind, Professor Lee, again, speaking as a medical expert amid the resurgence in the Northern Hemisphere in recent days, what role can Korea perhaps play to aid the global battle against the pandemic, Professor Lee?
Well, our strong suit has always been our exceptional capacity in testing. So I think we could probably transfer technology related to the diagnostic kits to the developing countries, especially the ones with weak public health care systems. We could also provide assistance in personnel upon request. I think it's going to be hard to change the values of those European nations, but in terms of diagnostic kits and other personal protective equipment, I think we can provide those.
Right. Dr. Kwak, what are your thoughts on forging a united global response to the pandemic?
Well, it's a little tricky because I hope that we could all, as a whole globe, really share our resources in means to physical resources as well as the knowledge that we have about the virus. But it's really hard when it comes to actually transferring people here and there across the countries and across the nations, and also shipping and exporting and importing products internationally, because it could also mean that could possibly create a chance for the virus to spread to other countries. As we have seen in the past, we were seeing a great number of people actually being in the influx from the overseas to contain the virus, and that actually ended up spreading so much of the GH strain of the virus into our country. So we still need to be careful of how much we're going to screen out in regards to the products or the people who are coming from overseas. But in regards to knowledge in fight against the virus, we could certainly share how to come up with the vaccine, how to come up with treatment regimen, because as a nation, a lot of the countries, they do have the capability and technology to come up with certain vaccinations or treatment regimen once they were shared of the knowledge. So I think it's important to be reminded that we need to share our knowledge to fight against the virus, and we also need to share possible medicinal regimen globally without any borders for that in that regard.
Right, and that of course these are efforts that can be done by the authorities here, but as people within a particular nation, we are being encouraged to get our flu shots, that is, to ward off a twindemic. But Professor Lee, here in Korea, there are some concerns about the flu shots. As a doctor, what would you recommend for the members of the public in preparation of getting their flu shots? What are some things that we should keep in mind to ensure that our flu shots are taken safely?
So I would recommend that the citizens don't get caught up by disinformation, misinformation, or false news about the flu shots that have not been validated. And you should just, at this moment, I think you should trust your government and put the communities first before you.
So you still support getting the flu shots this season,
yes,
of course,
I do,
right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
What are your thoughts, Dr. Kwak?
Let me tell you my personal story in regards to that. On the height of this whole news media coverage about possible side effects from vaccinations, I actually went ahead and got myself vaccinations on last Friday, because I was I was 100% certain that the accusations that are being made by the media has no strong evidence. I believe the vaccinations would not cause any side effects to the extent of what we're seeing on the media. I think it is 100% safe to be vaccinated for people, and especially if you are one of those who are having an underlying disease, I would strongly recommend those people on their better days when they are when they're feeling better, go in and get the vaccinations for themselves, because fighting against twindemic and fighting against just one sole virus of the pandemic is a completely different matter. We all, as a whole nation, need to be prepared for better fight, better efficacy in the fight against the virus.
Right. Professor Lee, perhaps we can end today's session with a few words of advice to our viewers here in Korea and abroad on ways to ensure safety amid the resurgence.
I think the basic message from the experts has been consistent. You should stick to the basics. You should wash your hands. Make sure you put on a mask when going to public spaces. And as Dr. Kwak mentioned, you should always keep up with your flu vaccination schedules. I think that's the message I have for the citizens out there.
I see. What message do you have, Dr. Kwak, for our citizens here in Korea and also around the world to stay safe amid the pandemic?
Well, I'm just personally partly more worried about the number that has risen up today. So I would urge everyone who's listening to actually not gather so much in the family, just for the time being, at least, because we are becoming definitely lenient, but also for the weeks to come, I think we should be more careful not to gather in numbers of people, especially inside a confined space, such as in a restaurant, such as in a bar, or such as in a church. So we should be careful not to gather in numbers of the people inside a confined space.
Right. Just out of curiosity, I have yet to get my flu shot, Dr. Kwak, but you mentioned that you got yours. Why is the authorities asking us to stay within the facility for about half an hour after getting our shots?
That's because if a vaccination was to cause any strong side effects, such as an anaphylaxis, it would happen in a matter of minutes. So it would usually happen within the 30 minutes of the persons who's received the vaccinations in the stay of the hospital. So they're actually suggesting that people stay around for another 30 minutes after they receive the vaccinations. It's not so possible for the vaccinations to cause any strong side effects a few days later, though, because there is no such immune reaction that happens only a few days later, relatively speaking, as opposed to a strong allergic reaction or immune reaction that happens only minutes after.
So anaphylaxis, you're referring to the allergic reaction to the vaccine, of course.
More so a very strong allergic reaction to the vaccination.
Is it common?
Well, I wouldn't say it's common at all. It's actually very rare for a person to go through that strong extent of the reaction. So we shouldn't even not worry about anaphylaxis, but just as a precaution, we are still suggesting that people stay around for another 30 minutes or so.
All right, Dr. Kwak, as always, thank you for your thoughts. And Professor Lee, over online, that is, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for today's edition. Tomorrow, we take a fresh look at herd immunity amid the prolonged pandemic. Do take care. Thank you for watching.